On a noisy morning at Harborview's docks, when everyone thought it was just another ordinary day, a K-9 labeled Rabid suddenly broke free and charged into the crowd. Officers drew their guns, shouting for people to clear the way. Every witness was certain the dog was about to attack, but at the height of the panic, a little girl stepped out, walking straight into the line of fire between the armed officers and the trembling K-9. The fog over Harborview's docks moved like slow breath, curling around stacks of crates and rusted bollards as dawn crept in. Gulls circled above the water, screaming at fishing boats sliding back toward shore. In the middle of all that sleepy routine sat an unmarked police transport van, engine humming, windows dark. Inside the steel-lined crate at the rear, a Belgian Malinois breathed in shallow bursts. His name on the paperwork was K-9 47 Shadow, but the men who'd worked with him used to call him simply Shadow, like he was something that moved at the edge of vision. Now chains rattled around his chest as he shifted his weight on the metal floor. He could smell salt, oil, fish, fear. Not as fear, not really. The stale, cold sweat of the officers who had loaded him in back at the highway, rest stop. Their voices still echoed in his head, clipped and uneasy, the way humans spoke when they were close to doing something they didn't want to name out loud. Officer Mark Dalton leaned against the van's bumper, coffee cooling in his hand. He watched the harbor wake up, ignoring the way the crate occasionally shuddered behind him. Beside him, Officer Reyes paced in tight circles, boots tapping against concrete. Reyes kept glancing at the rear doors like they might blow open on their own. "Relax," Mark muttered, not taking his eyes off the water. "He's sedated?" Paper said, "double dose?" Reyes snorted, but it came out thin. Paper also said he sent a sergeant to the ER. Twice. I'm not rolling the dice on that thing. A dull thump sounded from inside. Both men went silent. In the security office above the docks, Captain Sloan studied the scene through a smeared window. His gray hair was pulled back tight, jaw clenched as he flipped through Shadow's file for the 100th time. Red ink bled across the last pages. Unstable, aggressive, transfer for final behavioral evaluation. A harbor worker named Vince steered a forklift past the van, grumbling into his radio. The machine jerked as he hit a pothole, its heavy pallet clipping the side of the transport with a metallic slam. Inside the crate, Shadow lurched sideways, his shoulder striking a weak weld that had never been tested this hard. The bolt that held the crate to the wall had been loosened and retightened more times than anyone remembered. This time, it didn't tighten all the way. The jolt from the forklift finished the job. Metal shrieked softly as the crate shifted an inch, then another. Shadow felt the eye change immediately, muscles going rigid. He pressed his paw against the crate's inner latch, claws scraping steel. The first push did nothing. The second made the door tremble. On the third shove, driven by panic he didn't understand, the latch slipped, just a fraction. Cool air leaked in through the new gap, carrying sharper scents from the docks. Reyes paused mid-pace. "You hear that?" Mark started to answer, but a long horn blared from a ship entering the harbor, drowning out the faint rattle from the van's rear. Down the pier, someone yelled about a missing crate of frozen shrimp. A gull dove and stole a sandwich. The ordinary noise of the morning swallowed the warning. Inside, Shadow pushed harder. The door hinge groaned, then popped. Pain shot through his shoulder, but the gap widened. He shoved his head through, teeth bared, eyes wide. One last desperate surge, and the crate door burst outward, slamming against the van's wall with a clang that finally cut through everything else. Mark spun around, coffee slipping from his hand and exploding across the concrete. Reyes froze, eyes going huge. Standing in the mouth of the van, framed by shadow and exhaust, was Shadow himself, chest heaving, chain trailing from his collar, eyes catching the early light like twin embers. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The harbor seemed to inhale and hold it. Gulls hovered in place. The forklift's engine idled uselessly. Then Shadow jumped, landing hard on the dock, nails scraping, legs splaying before catching. He snapped his head left, then right, drinking in the maze of smells, the open space, the 100 escape paths. "Don't move!" Mark shouted, hand flying to his holster. Reyes already had his gun out, barrel shaking as it tracked the dog. "Captain, we have a breakout. K9 is loose!" His voice cracked over the radio, colliding with static and overlapping calls about trucks and nets and someone's missing son at the wharf. Across the loading zone, an older man in a faded navy jacket paused mid-step, a coil of rope hanging from his shoulder. His name was Jonah Hale, though no one bothered to remember it anymore. His gaze locked onto the Malinois sprinting free across the concrete. The color drained from his face, and under the harbor fog, his fingers tightened around the rope until his knuckles went white. The commotion on the docks rose slowly, like a tide people didn't notice until it was already at their knees. Vendors leaned out from behind stalls, unsure if they should run or stay. Shadow weaved between crates and coils of rope, his breath sharp, each sound around him snapping like a branch about to break. Officer Mark jogged after him, not chasing, just trying to contain the panic before it swallowed the whole harbor. His radio crackled with overlapping voices, half warnings, half wild guesses. In the chaos, Mark kept studying the dog's movements. There was no hunger in them, no threat, just a desperate search for somewhere quieter. Officer Reyes trailed farther back, gun out, hands trembling so hard the barrel shivered. Every bark from a nearby mutt made him flinch. He'd been bitten badly as a kid, and fear had a way of resurfacing at the worst time. Now, watching Shadow dart across the pier, that old scar pulsed like a fresh wound. Word spread quicker than the dog could run. Someone shouted that Shadow was rabid. Another yelled that he'd attacked 2 officers. A fisherman swore he'd seen foam at the dog's mouth. By the time Captain Sloan stepped out of the security office, the rumor had already grown into something close to a sentence. Shadow slipped behind a stack of crab traps, crouching low as a forklift rumbled past. The engine's sputtering backfire made him jerk sideways, claws clattering on the slick planks. His ears pinned flat. He wasn't planning an attack. He was trying not to lose himself to the noise that shook him from the inside out. Mark approached slowly, palms open, voice low, not gentle, just steady enough not to add to the tension. He'd seen spooked horses act like this, bodies tight, senses flooded. But this was worse. Shadow's eyes flicked from sound to sound, not to target, but to escape paths that kept closing around him. Reyes finally caught up, sweat beating at his temples. "Mark, we need to put him down before he goes for someone," he whispered, panic forcing his voice into something thin and high. Mark shook his head, keeping his gaze on the trembling Malinois. "He's not hunting, he's cornered. There's a difference." A crowd had begun forming near the bait shop, drawn by fear, curiosity, or the hope of recording something dramatic on their phones. The noise pressed in like a wall. Shadow rose slowly, head lowered, posture tight enough to snap. The smell of fish guts mixed with gasoline scraped through his senses, making the world tilt. Lyle, the old boat repairman, stood a few steps away, arms folded, his weathered face watching the dog instead of the officers. He muttered under his breath, almost too soft to catch. "That one's not sick. He's remembering something, or trying not to." A child somewhere in the crowd started crying, a sharp, shrill sound that made Shadow's whole body jolt. He scrambled backward, nearly slipping off the edge of the dock before he caught himself. Mark cursed under his breath, seeing fear, not rage, flare in the dog's eyes like a struck match. Captain Sloan's voice boomed across the pier, steady and stern. "Everyone step back. Officers, form a perimeter." The crowd split unevenly, though some lingered, hoping the story unfolding might turn violent. Sloan studied Shadow with wary eyes, his hand near his holster, but not on it. Not yet. Shadow crept toward a narrow space between two shipping crates drawn to the darker, quieter corner. But when a tourist dropped a heavy cooler across the way, the thud cracked through him like thunder. He whipped around, tail low, legs rigid, breath coming fast enough to sting his ribs. Every instinct in him screamed to run. Reyes raised his weapon again, knuckles white on the grip. "Captain, he's seconds from snapping." Sloan didn't answer immediately. He saw what Mark saw, the shaking, the shrinking posture, the way Shadow kept retreating instead of lunging. But command required certainty, and the pressure from the growing crowd pressed down on him like weight. Shadow backed into an alley of crates, trembling as voices rose on all sides. The world was closing in, each sound sharper than the last. His chest heaved, and for a moment his vision flickered the way it had the night everything in his old life tore apart. Noise, heat, shouting, too much all at once. Mark took one cautious step forward, breath steady, trying to reach the dog before fear claimed him completely. But before he could speak or signal or even breathe again, a new noise cut across the dock, a brittle, high voice calling for someone lost in the crowd. And Shadow heard it first. The voice floated across the dock like a thin thread, barely cutting through the noise. Yet to Shadow, it sliced clean through everything else. His ears snapped forward, body stilling in an instant. The sound wasn't loud, but it carried something raw and trembling that pulled at a place deep in his memory. Emma Carter, small enough to be mistaken for someone's toddler sister, squeezed between two columns of stacked crates. Her cheeks were flushed, eyes wide as she searched the crowd for her mother. She didn't see the officers. She didn't see the drawn guns. She only saw a maze she didn't understand. A few vendors tried to wave her back, but she drifted farther in, pulled by panic and the need to find a familiar face. The chatter around her muddled into noise, a low hum of adult fear she couldn't interpret. Her boots slapped softly against the wet boards, leaving small, uneven prints behind her. Shadow felt the shift before anyone else. The fear in the child's voice, the quick breaths, the trembling steps. His instincts locked on, not as a hunter, but as something tangled between duty and old heartbreak. His tail lowered, body tightening as he stared through the maze of crates to find the sound again. Officer Mark noticed the change in the dog first. Shadow wasn't looking for an escape anymore. His head angled toward the center of the pier, eyes sharpening into something troubled and strangely focused. Mark followed that line of sight and felt his stomach drop when he spotted the small figure weaving forward. Reyes cursed softly under his breath, panic rising. "Is that a kid? Why would a kid be in the middle of this?" His voice shook so hard the syllables clattered together. Sloan barked orders for the crowd to clear, but too many people were frozen, watching, unsure if this was the moment everything would go wrong. Emma turned a corner too quickly and stumbled, her hand scraping against a metal crate. She winced but kept moving, calling again for her mom, the words stretching with fear. That single cry cut through Shadow like a blade. His breath hitched, and for a moment the dock dissolved into a memory he'd tried to outrun. The memory flashed sharp. Smoke, heat. A child screaming in a burning hall, his paws slipping on ash. He blinked hard, shaking it off, but the echo twisted through him. His body surged forward on impulse, nails clicking against wood as he moved toward the sound. He didn't snarl. He didn't bare his teeth. He simply ran. Mark reached out as if he could stop the dog by touch alone. "Shadow, wait!" But the Malinois was already slipping between crates, a streak of muscle and fear-driven instinct. The crowd gasped as he broke from cover, his silhouette cutting across the open pier toward the girl who had no idea danger existed. Emma froze when she finally spotted him rushing toward her, her breath snagged, her head lifting slowly as if unsure whether she was imagining the shape barreling through the fog. The world around her dimmed, the voices thinning to a faint rumble she couldn't decipher. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She just stood there, small and shaking. Sloan shouted for officers to take aim, his voice cracking from strain. Reyes lifted his weapon with hands trembling so violently the muzzle wobbled in the air. "Captain, he's locked on her!" People in the crowd yelled for someone to grab the child, but no one dared step into the dog's path. Shadow closed the distance with powerful strides, water spraying beneath his paws as he cut across a slick patch of boards. His ears flattened, not in aggression, but in instinctual bracing, the world narrowing to the fragile figure in front of him. His breath came in sharp bursts, not hunger, not rage, pure panic. Emma took a single step back, boots sliding on the damp wood. Her eyes glistened, not understanding why a dog she'd never met was racing toward her with the force of a storm. The moment stretched thin, every heartbeat stacked on the next, waiting for someone, anyone, to move first. And Shadow, driven by fear he couldn't name, pushed harder into the run, the pounding of his paws echoing across the harbor. The officers tensed. The crowd held its breath. Emma stood alone at the center of it all, hands curled into trembling fists at her sides. Then the dog lunged into the open space between them, and the world braced for the wrong kind of ending. Shadow hit the open stretch of dock with a force that made the boards tremble. His body was low, muscles coiled, eyes locked on Emma as if pulled by something stronger than instinct. Wind whipped past his ears, carrying the smell of salt, metal, and the thin thread of fear rising from the little girl. Emma stumbled back another step, small hands lifting without intention, as if her body was trying to shield her from something she didn't yet understand. She could hear shouting behind her, heavy, frantic voices, but none of it made sense. All she saw was a large dog charging toward her through the morning haze. Officer Mark sprinted forward, breath burning in his chest. He wasn't fast enough. He knew it. The distance between them was shrinking too quickly, each second folding into the next with punishing speed. "Hold your fire," he yelled, though he wasn't sure anyone heard him over the pounding of feet on wet wood. Reyes, trembling, raised his weapon again. His breath came in shallow, panicked bursts, the memory of teeth and childhood fear blurring into the present. "Captain, he's going to hit her," he cried, voice cracking under the weight of the moment. His finger hovered near the trigger, frozen between instinct and terror. Captain Sloan steadied his stance, jaw clenched hard. He aimed carefully, not with anger, but with a sorrow that settled heavy in his eyes. "Wait, wait," he muttered to himself, studying the dog's posture, trying to find something, anything, that made sense beyond the chaos twisting around them. Shadow lunged the final few feet, but something changed in him at the last breath. His ears dropped back, paws digging into the boards as he fought against the momentum he himself had created. His claws screeched against the dock, carving shallow grooves into the damp wood as he threw his weight sideways. The crowd gasped as Shadow skidded to a halt inches from Emma's knees. His whole frame trembled from the effort, chest heaving, breath coming in tight, painful bursts. There was no snarl on his lips, no flash of teeth, only wide, haunted eyes staring up at the child who stood frozen before him. Emma didn't scream. She didn't fall. She simply stared back, her tiny shoulders rising and falling with quick breaths. She didn't understand why he'd stopped or why he looked more scared than she felt. Her small boots shifted slightly on the slick boards, but she didn't run. Something about his shaking held her still. A hush fell over the dock, a silence so sudden and deep that it felt unnatural. The sea breeze softened. The gulls quieted. Even the murmuring crowd seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment to tip one way or another. Mark slowed his run, stunned, hands lifting toward the dog, but stopping short. Shadow kept his body pressed close to the ground, tail tucked, trembling as if expecting a blow. His gaze flicked to Emma's hands, then back to her face. He didn't retreat. He didn't advance. He simply waited, caught between instinct and a memory that pulled at him from somewhere far beyond this dock. Emma lifted one hand, not fast, not planned, just a gentle, uncertain motion born from something soft inside her. The movement made the crowd wince, expecting the dog to snap, but Shadow didn't flinch. Instead, his breath steadied a fraction, as if the small gesture reached through the noise clouding his mind. Reyes sagged against a crate, lowering his gun with a shaky exhale he couldn't fully control. He stopped, he whispered, more to himself than anyone else, disbelief coloring every syllable. Sloane didn't move at all. His eyes stayed trained on the pair, confusion and wonder warring quietly in his stance. Shadow dipped his head, almost bowing, his nose brushing the boards in front of Emma's shoes. It wasn't submission. It wasn't fear. It was something quieter, like recognition or the fragile beginning of trust trying to break through years of tangled memories. For a long moment, Emma simply watched him, her face softening as the trembling dog held still before her. Then, in the smallest voice, she whispered, "It's okay." And somehow, against every fear ringing through the dock, Shadow believed her. A strange stillness settled over the dock, holding Shadow in a fragile calm he hadn't known in months. Emma's small whisper lingered in the air like something almost warm. But deep inside him, beneath the trembling and the fear, something else stirred, an echo he'd tried to outrun since the night everything broke. Shadow's gaze drifted, not away from Emma, but past her, as if the world behind her shifted into something darker. The dock faded, the voices blurred, the smell of salt and fish dissolved into smoke, ash, and the sting of burned drywall. His chest tightened, and the memory pulled him under before he could resist. It had been late. Too late for a child to be awake. He remembered the alarm screeching through the narrow hallway, lights flashing, the heat rolling across the floor. His handler had clipped the lead to his collar, voice steady, hand firm. "Easy, Shadow. We've got a kid inside. Let's bring her home." Shadow remembered the girl's scent first, thin, scared, hiding under collapsed beams in the far bedroom. He had crawled on his belly to reach her, paws slipping on soot, ears burning under falling embers. When he found her, she'd clung to him, tiny fingers gripping his fur like he was the only solid thing left. He helped guide her toward the exit, nudging her forward with soft whines, keeping himself between her and the fire's growl. But halfway down the hall, the roof cracked. A beam fell behind them, sending a wave of hot air that threw both of them sideways. The girl screamed, a piercing, helpless sound that cut straight through him. That scream stayed with him, high-pitched, shaking, filled with a terror no animal could ignore. Even now, the memory of it jolted through his nerves like static. He had nudged her again, pushing her toward the firefighter who reached in, glove outstretched. She survived. Shadow knew she survived, but she never looked at him the same way again. When he tried to follow her out, she flinched and sobbed harder, burying her face in the rescuer's shoulder. The sound wasn't anger, it wasn't blame, it was fear. And it made something inside him break. His handler had tried to steady him, but the damage settled deep, turning familiar commands into triggers that shook his focus. After that night, every sharp noise felt like a threat. Every shout twisted into that same terrified cry. Training became harder. Commands blurred into echoes of panic. He didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He only understood that the world expected him to be steady while his insides trembled like glass. Shadow's trembling grew as the memory tightened its grip. On the dock, the crowd saw only a dangerous dog crouched before a small girl. They couldn't see the smoke-filled hallway replaying behind his eyes. They couldn't feel the ache of failing a child he had fought to save. Only Emma's quiet presence held him in place. Emma's fingers twitched slightly, not touching him yet, but close enough that he could sense her warmth. Her breathing steadied, softer than the scream still ringing through his mind. Something about her voice, her posture, the gentle way she moved, it didn't match the fear he expected. It didn't hurt. Officer Mark watched the dog's faraway look with a frown. He recognized the hollow stare of an animal reliving something too heavy for words. "He's not dangerous," Mark whispered, more certain now. "He's remembering." But Reyes shook his head, unable to see past the trembling. Fear made him blind to everything else. Shadow blinked hard, the memory collapsing into itself, retreating like smoke sucked back into a broken chimney. His gaze returned to the dock, to Emma standing inches away. The air felt lighter now, though his legs still shook. Emma lowered her small hand a little more, steady and unafraid. Something inside Shadow eased, a thread loosening, a pressure lifting just enough to breathe. He exhaled slowly, the tremor in his chest softening. Emma's eyes held no fear, only a quiet, curious kindness. And for the first time since that burning hallway, a child's presence didn't make him flinch. At the edge of the pier, Jonah Hale watched with a look no one else noticed, recognition carved deep in his weathered face. He had seen this kind of pain in working dogs before, the kind humans misread as aggression. And in Shadow's bowed posture, he saw not danger, but a wound years in the making. The fog rolled in again, softening the sharp corners of the dock. Emma took one small step closer. Shadow didn't retreat. He lowered his head further, as if surrendering to a truth louder than memory itself. This child didn't see a threat. She saw him. For a moment, the dock breathed easier. Emma's presence had pulled Shadow out of the memory that clawed at him, and the trembling in his legs eased. The crowd remained tense, but something softer flickered through the air, a small, fragile hope that maybe the danger had passed. They didn't know the real danger hadn't even begun. A low rumble trembled beneath the planks, subtle at first, easily mistaken for a shifting tide or a forklift engine turning over. But Jonah Hale stiffened, sensing the vibration deeper than the others. His eyes darted toward the upper loading ramp, where a lone truck driver waved his arms in panic, shouting words swallowed by distance. Shadow felt it before anyone else, an instinctive warning that cut through his chest, sharper than memory. His ears shot up, head turning sharply to the left. The air carried a metallic whine, the kind that meant metal under strain, something too heavy moving too fast. Emma glanced toward him, following his gaze with confusion. At the top of the ramp, a 20-foot container had snapped free from its wheel restraints. It rolled backward slowly at first, bumping against the rusted guardrail. But the incline was steep. Gravity won. The container broke loose completely, gathering speed as it barreled down the slope toward the dock where Emma and the officers stood frozen. Gasps rippled through the crowd as realization struck. Mark's face drained of color. "Move! Everyone move!" he shouted, sprinting forward with everything he had. But the container was already thundering down, too fast, too heavy, too close. Reyes stumbled backward, nearly dropping his gun as fear tightened around his throat. Emma stood locked in place, trapped by the same shock that often grips children when danger arrives too suddenly to understand. The metal monster roared toward her, wheels scraping sparks across the ramp. The entire dock seemed to tilt toward disaster, the air tightening into a single, breathless moment. Shadow didn't think. He didn't measure distance or weigh the risk. His instincts, once broken by fire and fear, sharpened into a single, fierce point. He launched forward, paws hitting the boards with explosive force. Every muscle in his body stretched toward Emma, driven by the same instinct that once saved another child from flames. Mark's shout vanished behind him. The crowd blurred. Even the rolling thunder of the container dulled beneath the pounding of his own heartbeat. All he saw was the girl, the tiny figure rooted in fear, her eyes wide, her breath shallow, her hand still hovering where she'd tried to comfort him moments before. Shadow slammed into Emma with a force just gentle enough to avoid hurting her, yet strong enough to knock her clear of the container's path. His body curved around hers, shielding her as they tumbled onto a patch of wet boards. The impact jarred his ribs, but he didn't loosen his hold. His only focus was keeping her alive. The container crashed into the edge of the dock a heartbeat later, splintering a row of wooden posts, sending shards flying in every direction. A violent clang rattled across the harbor as the metal beast ground to a halt inches from where Emma had been standing. Water erupted beneath the planks, spraying upward like cold breath from the sea. Mark reached them first, dropping to his knees with a choked mixture of relief and disbelief. Shadow held his position over Emma until the shaking in the dock quieted. Only when the danger fully passed did he loosen his stance, stepping back just enough to allow Mark to scoop the trembling girl into his arms. Emma clung to Mark, but her gaze remained fixed on Shadow. Her breath hitched, but not from fear. Something gentler shimmered in her eyes. Gratitude, trust, the quiet understanding that this dog, the one everyone claimed was dangerous, had put himself in harm's way for her. Shadow staggered back a step, his legs unsteady from the collision. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, the old fear still coiling through him, but softened now by something new. He kept his eyes on Emma, not to check for danger, but to make sure she was safe. Reyes stared at the scene with his mouth half open, the gun hanging uselessly at his side. He whispered, barely audible. He saved her. He actually saved her. His fear cracked, replaced by a dawning realization that shook him more deeply than the threat ever had. The crowd remained silent, as if the entire dock had been stunned into reverence. Jonah exhaled slowly, eyes softening with a kind of understanding that came only from witnessing a wounded spirit choose courage over survival. He murmured, almost to himself, "Good boy. You remembered who you are." And as the wind shifted, carrying the scent of sea salt and broken wood, Shadow stood quietly, his breathing steadier now. The fear hadn't vanished, but for the first time in a long time, it no longer owned him. He had stepped into danger, not to run, not to hide, but to protect. And because of that, everything about this story was about to change. The dock felt different the next morning, as if the air itself remembered the crash of the runaway container. People moved quietly, still stunned by the sight of a dog they'd feared throwing himself into danger for a child. But the calm didn't last. Rumors spread fast, and soon a white evaluation truck rolled onto the pier. Shadow stood inside a temporary enclosure, pacing slowly along the chain fence. His steps were uneven from the hit he'd taken, but his eyes stayed focused on the walkway where Emma had last stood. Every sound made his ears twitch, not in panic this time, but in restless worry, as if something important was missing. Captain Sloan briefed the evaluation officers in a low, clipped tone. The men wore stiff uniforms and unreadable expressions, the kind used by people who make decisions others don't want to carry. Mark stood beside them, arms crossed, jaw tight. He knew what these evaluations meant. One wrong reaction could seal Shadow's fate. Reyes kept his distance, still shaken from yesterday. His fear hadn't fully faded, but it had cracked open enough to let doubt slip through. He watched Shadow quietly, noticing the way the dog kept glancing toward the harbor entrance, searching for the child he'd protected. Something about that tugged at him more than he expected. Shadow stiffened when the evaluators approached his gate. Their boots thudded too sharply against the boards, their movements too measured, too cold. They spoke in short commands, testing obedience, watching posture. Each gesture reminded him of old drills he used to perform without hesitation, drills that now tangled with echoes of fear. The first command came harsh and sudden. "Sit!" The evaluator barked the word like a gunshot. Shadow flinched, lowering his head but unable to gather himself enough to obey. His legs quivered beneath him, torn between compliance and the memories tightening around his ribs. The evaluator scribbled something on his clipboard. A second order followed, louder. "Stay!" The man stepped closer, too close, his tone cutting, impatient. Shadow backed up, not snarling, not lunging, just trying to keep a safe distance. His breathing turned shallow again, each command pressing harder on the wounds no one else could see. The evaluator frowned, marking another note. Mark stepped forward, frustration breaking through his professionalism. "He's not being aggressive. He's scared. That's not the same thing." But the evaluators weren't interested in explanations. They were looking for control, compliance, certainty. And Shadow, trembling and confused, couldn't give them that. As the evaluators prepared for one final test, a soft scrape echoed near the supply shed. No one noticed at first, not until a small figure slipped behind Mark and crouched near the fence. Emma had found her way back onto the dock, her backpack bouncing lightly as she crawled beneath the lowest rail with quiet determination. Shadow sensed her before he saw her. His head snapped toward the sound, ears lifting, body going still in an instant. The tremble in his legs eased, replaced by a sharp, focused calm. When Emma stepped into view, brushing a stray hair from her eyes, his entire posture softened as if someone had smoothed the fear out of him. Emma ignored the officer's startled gasps and walked straight toward the gate. "Hi, buddy," she whispered, her voice steady in a way only a child's could be. Soft, simple, truthful. Shadow pressed his nose between the bars, tail lowering but not tucked, waiting for her touch, like it anchored him back to the present. Mark held up a hand, stopping the evaluators from pulling her away. "Wait," he said quietly. "Just watch." It wasn't command or challenge, it was belief, something the others hadn't found yet. The evaluators exchanged uncertain glances, their clipboards momentarily forgotten as the girl slipped her small fingers through the fence. Emma gave a gentle command she'd only heard once from a distance. "Sit!" Shadow obeyed instantly, lowering himself with a slow, deliberate motion, his eyes locked on her face. Another command followed. "Stay." He held perfectly still, breathing steady, the shaking gone as if it had never existed. The evaluators stared, their skepticism cracking under the weight of what they were seeing. Shadow wasn't untrainable. He wasn't unstable. He only listened to the one voice that didn't sharpen the noise inside him, the one voice that didn't sound like fear or fire or shouting. He listened to the voice that made him feel safe. Emma leaned her forehead gently against the fence, her hands resting on the metal. "You're okay," she whispered. Shadow closed his eyes, leaning closer, letting her presence quiet the storm that the evaluator's commands could never reach. The dock fell silent again, but this time the silence felt hopeful. And for the first time since the evaluation began, the men in charge hesitated, not because of danger, but because they finally realized they had misread everything about the dog sitting calmly before the little girl who had changed his world. The evaluators stood frozen, watching the girl and the dog as if the world had shifted under their feet. The dock was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only when something undeniable has taken shape. Shadow remained seated, his gaze steady, his breathing calm, anchored by the presence of the small child beside the fence. Captain Sloane removed his cap and rubbed the back of his neck, the weight of the moment settling deep into his shoulders. He had spent years making hard calls, trusting procedure over instinct, but watching this trembling dog obey a little girl with more trust than he'd shown any adult left him strangely humbled. Emma whispered another soft command, one she made up entirely on her own. "Come here, buddy." Shadow rose gently and pressed his head against the gate, tail brushing the ground in small, uncertain sweeps. There was no hint of fear now, only a quiet need to be near her, as if she steadied something the world had broken. Jonah stepped forward, his voice low but firm. "That's not aggression. That's a dog holding himself together with every ounce he's got." His weathered eyes lingered on Shadow, then on Emma, as if recognizing a connection too rare to ignore. "He's not dangerous. He's hurt, and she's the only one who reaches past the hurt." Mark nodded, relief softening the tension in his face. "He saved her life yesterday. That has to count for something." Rhea shifted beside him, shame creeping into his expression, the weight of his earlier fear pulling at him. He exhaled shakily. I was wrong. He wasn't going for her. He was protecting her." One evaluator cleared his throat, the clipboard suddenly feeling unnecessary in his hands. "We've seen enough," he said quietly. "This dog isn't rabid. He isn't unstable. He's bonded. To her." The others exchanged silent nods, the kind made when people finally agree on a truth that had been sitting in front of them all along. Captain Sloane approached the gate, pausing when Shadow looked up at him. There was no growl, no tension, only exhaustion and a flicker of trust, trying to rebuild itself. Sloane took a slow breath before speaking, voice softer than anyone expected. "We're not putting down a dog that risks his life for a child. Not on my watch." Emma beamed, hugging the cold metal gate as if it were a part of Shadow himself. Her joy was simple, pure, the kind that made even hardened officers feel something stir in their chest. "He can stay with us?" she asked, eyes wide with hope. Sloane hesitated only a moment before nodding. Her mother, breathless from catching up, rushed in to pull her close, but even she paused when she saw the dog's gentle posture. Shadow stepped back just enough to give her space, his tail lowering in quiet respect. Emma giggled softly. "See? He's a good boy. He's just scared sometimes." Jonah approached Sloane with steady steps, extending a hand. "If you're willing," he said, "I can take him under a special rehab program. Not a cage, not punishment, just structure, time, and the care he should have had." His voice held no pride, only calm certainty. "And she can visit. It'll help him heal." Sloane looked at Shadow, really looked, and finally reached for the pen clipped to his vest. With one firm motion, he signed the transfer orders on the evaluator's clipboard. "Then that's his path," he said. "Give him a chance to become who he was meant to be." Shadow watched Emma as Jonah opened the gate. The dog stepped forward carefully, as if unsure whether he was allowed to cross into this new world. Emma knelt down, arms open, and Shadow leaned into her embrace with a soft, relieved sigh, his weight settling against her like a promise. The wind shifted across the dock, carrying the faint scent of seaweed, wood, and something warm. Hope rediscovered. Mark wiped a hand across his face, smiling despite himself. Reyes breathed out slowly, the tightness in him finally breaking. Jonah rested a steady hand on Shadow's back, guiding him gently toward a safer tomorrow. As Emma stood to leave, Shadow followed a few steps before stopping, understanding instinctively that she had to go home. She pressed a kiss to the top of his head. "I'll come visit," she whispered. Shadow closed his eyes at the sound of her voice, letting it settle into the deepest part of him. And as the girl walked away with her mother and the officers slowly dispersed, Shadow stood at Jonah's side, no longer trembling, no longer lost. For the first time since the fire, he felt the ground steady beneath him. He wasn't a threat. He wasn't broken. He was a protector who had finally found someone who saw him clearly, and that was enough to change everything. Josh? Chandi. If this story touched you, let me know by dropping a simple comment down below. Even a 0 or 1 is enough to show you're still here with us. Your voice helps these stories live on. And if you'd like to follow more heartfelt moments between people and the animals who change their lives, make sure to subscribe. There are many more stories waiting for you.